See You Now is a podcast highlighting the innovative and human-centered solutions that nurses are coming up with to solve for today's most challenging healthcare problems. Created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association, and hosted by nurse economist and health tech specialist, Shauna Butler.
As we are on our 100th episode, we felt we needed to do something that honored the milestone of getting to 100. And we wanted to be in a place and a space and in a community of trailblazers and changemakers and pioneers.
So right now we're at the National American Indian Museum in Washington, D.C., space that's inspirational for our community, but also just being intentional of being surrounded by history.
We are bringing the history to life of two amazing women, Virginia Allen, one of the last surviving Black angels who helped cure tuberculosis, and Maria Smilios, author of the Black Angels, the Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis.
The story of the Black Angels is a story of these women who saved tens of millions of lives with the advent of isoniazid and being on the front lines, and in doing so changed the course of history.
Welcome to See You Now. I'm Shauna Butler. After 4 years of producing stories covering a vast array of topics from a diverse set of experts and voices, this is episode 100. See You Now is on a mission to uncover, recognize, and elevate the human-centered solutions driven by nurses addressing today's most challenging healthcare problems. And there's been no shortage of compelling, surprising, meaningful, and moving stories to share. We've grown from the idea of a podcast to a highly anticipated, award-winning listen, appreciated by an enthusiastic, global, diverse audience, and a rich library of stories that are both timely and timeless. Reaching 100 of anything is kind of a big deal, a proud moment to celebrate. So to mark the milestone, we were in search of the perfect story to personify our mission and to fit the moment. And we found it. For this episode, we traveled to Washington, D.C. to join the DNPs of Color conference and their call to nursing's game changers and trailblazers, which included a celebration of the highly acclaimed new book, The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis, and meeting the last known living Black angel, Nurse Virginia Allen. Before traveling to the conference, we caught up with Maria Smilios, author of The Black Angels, to get a deeper sense of the book and the stories she uncovered. Here's what she had to say. Maria, this is such a gorgeous book and a story and history and an accounting of these nurses that responded to a moment in time and an opportunity. How do you describe the Black Angels and their untold story?
The Black Angels, the untold story of the nurses who helped cure tuberculosis, is really a story that recovers the voices of these extraordinary Black nurses who began migrating from the Jim Crow South to Staten Island in 1929, when the city was in danger of plunging into a public health crisis. The book follows the lives of individual nurses, beginning with Edna Sutton Ballard, Missouri Luvino Meadows Walker, and then Virginia Allen. Virginia Allen is the niece of Edna Sutton. Virginia had just graduated high school in Detroit. She came in August of 1947, just shy of 17, and she begins working at Seaview on the children's ward, which some people said was one of the saddest places on earth. And then we have the patients they cared for and the communities they lived in, and we come upon this galvanizing moment in history where the cure for TB is announced at Seaview Hospital. The two doctors in charge of running the trials were Dr. Edward Robichek, who came to Seaview in 1940, and Dr. Irving Selikoff. When I spoke to Dr. Robichek's son, one of the first things he said to me is, my father always told me that without these Black nurses, none of these drug trials with isoniazid that happened at Seaview Hospital would have been possible. And without the drug trials, we wouldn't have had a cure. When you think about what did these nurses do and what their role was, we have to really look at the individual nurses themselves. Edna Sutton Ballard was a surgical nurse. She worked in Seaview's surgical unit. Edna was seeing terrible things, operations that often turned to butchery. Ribs 6 to 8 being sawed out at a time, chests being stuffed with ping pong balls or wax packs to keep the lungs collapsed. Masuria worked on the men's ward. The men's ward was a rough place, often compared to a bar. The men were gruff, they were angry. She's constantly being bombarded by racial slurs, by people who are depressed. The men got violent, they fought with each other, they threw things at the nurses. I talk about a moment in the book where she has to shave a man who's incapable of moving, and he's just so angry at the world that every time she moves his face, he yells and she feels his spittle going onto her neck. So this is what she endures every single day on the wards. Nurses who worked on the women's wards endured similar things with the women who were depressed in a different way. These were mothers who didn't see their children for years and years. The nurses become these repositories holding all of these stories of these people who are sick and suffering, and they have to find ways to not only make them feel better, but to themselves psychologically deal with all of this suffering. The nurses did this for years and years and decades, and in 1951, Dr. Robitschek's partner, Dr. Selikoff, was a pretty well-known lung doctor, and he was also working at Seaview a couple of days a week. And he gets this phone call in May of 1951 from Hoffman LaRoche and a doctor there. And the doctor says to him, hey, you know those trials that we've been running on mice with this drug, isoniazid? He said, no, they look pretty good. Would you like to try them on humans? And 2 days later, Robitschek and Selikoff meet with the board of Seaview, and they are approved for these trials. And so begin what one journalist said, the greatest human experimentation in medical history, the isoniazid trials. The people at the front of these trials are the nurses. They knew the disease better than anybody. The nurses had been working there for decades. They knew how tuberculosis ebbed and flowed. They knew its nuances. They knew how the microbe was arrogant and wily, and how it could lay low. One morning, somebody would wake up feeling okay, and by the afternoon, they'd be hemorrhaging. The nurses could pick up intonations in a voice that would signal to them something is wrong. And so the nurses are the first ones to administer these drugs. And every day, the nurses are not only taking vitals, but they're looking at the emotional state of the patients. They're looking at the physical state. They're watching them when they sleep. And they're taking these really meticulous, copious notes. Side effects, dizzy, blurry vision. And the one that struck me the most was twitching during sleeping. And that gives you a really amazing window into how astute these nurses were to notice that people's legs began to twitch while they were sleeping. And from there, they start to compile all of the data on isoniazid. You begin to realize none of this could happen without them, because Robitschek can't be watching 92 patients all the time, every day, taking these types of notes. The only people that could be doing this are the ones in the front lines. A lot of the work that the nurses did in the hospital would inform what they did to fight against systemic and institutional racism and microaggressions. These nurses played a pivotal role in helping to desegregate the New York City hospital system. They also played a really important role in nursing practice and education. and really in getting the American Nurses Association to admit Black nurses. This prepared them for what would then become the civil rights movement, and many of them joined the civil rights movement.
With that primer, let's head over to the stage at the gorgeous National Museum of the American Indian and join the DNPs of Color conference, where nurses Joanna Seltzer Uribe and Ravenne Aponte, creators of the Nurses You Should Know project, are on stage with Maria Smilios and Virginia Allen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us to speak with Virginia and Maria today, and for recognizing how our living history can and should be woven into our professional conferences. During my research into the history of nursing education and curricula, I found myself reviewing some archival American Journal of Nursing issues from the early 60s. I came across a letter to the editor admonishing the journal for supporting civil rights legislation. When I looked to the left of that letter, I came upon another. This one was penned by Estelle Mazzie Osborne. She was writing to express her concern that over a decade after desegregation, there was no Black leadership on the boards of the ANA or the NLN, and stated, quote, "Policies and goodwill must be linked to action to make any social movement effective." The sheer dichotomy of these letters, staring at me side by side, combined with my abject ignorance that conversations like these were even occurring, initiated the thinking that started this project. The wheels began to turn between us of how we could best fill the gap in our nursing history and better represent the contributions of nurses of color. When we looked at a 2-page timeline covering the 1970s, there is literally no mention at the founding of the National Black Nurses Association, American Indian Nurses Association, nor the National Association of Hispanic Nurses, all of which were founded in the 1970s. And there was certainly no mention of nurses like the Black Angels. Once Ravenne and I got started researching and putting together stories of less-known nurses, we couldn't stop. We launched the Nurses You Should Know project in February of 2021. And true to our goal, we profiled the nurses we felt did not have the name recognition they deserved. Raven's story on Virginia Allen was published in our first cohort of stories just a few weeks after our launch. Ravenne and I essentially wanted to course correct our professional history, so the stories of nurses like Estelle Mazzie Osborne and Virginia Allen could be as commonly known as Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, or Lillian Wald. And here is Ravenne, co-creator of Nurses You Should Know.
Thank you, Joanna. All right, ready to talk about Black Angels? Today we have the pleasure of speaking with both Virginia and Maria, two amazing women. Virginia Allen, one of the last surviving Black angels who helped cure tuberculosis, and Maria Smilios, author of The Black Angels, The Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. Virginia Allen, at the age of 16 in 1947, joined the staff at Seaview Hospital in Staten Island, New York, which was one of the few public sanatoriums open to treat patients with tuberculosis. She worked there for over a decade, serving on the front lines, caring for patients until a cure was found for tuberculosis in 1951. Now, Virginia's story is not only inspiring, giving her individual contributions, but she represents many Black nurses throughout the early 20th century who endured a long battle of discrimination and challenges as they fought for their space in the nursing profession. They were barred from joining professional nursing organizations like the American Nurses Association, and this oftentimes forced them to, move across the country to find a job, especially when you think about all the movement that happened in the Great Migration. Nurses were also a part of that. Virginia is really a trailblazer as she represents the relentless courage of a generation of nurses who carved out the space, sometimes at the own expense of their safety and well-being, for the next generation of nurses and to provide the care for those who were neglected. Looking at the audience, we see that their efforts were not in vain. And as we can see, Virginia's story and that of the Black Angels not only caught our attention, but others as well. Maria Smilios, author of Black Angels. Maria spent the last 8 years piecing together family stories, records, and archives to illuminate the contributions of these Black nurses and staff at Seaview Hospital who really put themselves on the front line until a cure was found. So before we get started with our questions, I'm going to let Maria share a piece of her book with you all.
Hi, first I want to thank Dr. McCamey for inviting me here and Virginia and giving us this opportunity to talk about this book and this really important, incredible story that until a month ago existed just in the confines of Staten Island. I just want to read to you and set up the story of what these women and Virginia's aunt, who came in 1929, were walking into in Seaview Hospital in Staten Island. And so I'm going to read a section of the Black Angels. And the name came from the patients. They used to call the nurses their Black Angels. And so that's where the title of the book came from. This takes place in spring of 1929. No one knew exactly how it started or who set it in motion. But in the spring of 1929, suddenly, inexorably, the white nurses at Seaview Hospital began quitting. One by one, they hung up their uniforms and walked out. Their reasons varied. Many of them were weary of the long commute from Manhattan to Staten Island and the successive days of 12-hour shifts. Some cited the chronic mental and physical toll their job demanded. But most were leaving to escape tuberculosis, the Great White Plague, the robber of youth, the captain of the men of death, and its victims, the infected, incurable, indigent consumptives. That's who came to Seaview, New York's largest municipal sanatorium. On its floors, hundreds of patients lay in iron-framed beds, languishing, their bodies swarming with millions of arrogant microbes that gnawed at lungs, kidneys, and tongues, their spines, bones, and brains. All day long, they sweated and groaned and cried out. They coughed and choked and spit up blood, each hack sending swarms of live germs onto bedpans and sheets, tables, chairs, and doorknobs. The bacteria landed on walls and nightstands and window shades. It drifted under beds and down hallways, slinking into every room and corner of the ward. It was always present, swirling, lurking, waiting to strike anyone who wasn't already sick. And all it took was a single inhalation. Over the years, the nurses watched their colleagues fall ill. They saw how their faces turned ashen, how their eyes burned from a fever that climbed and climbed, and how their skin exuded a sickly odor that no amount of washing could eradicate. Some recovered, at least temporarily. Others died in the wards where they once worked, mouthing God in heaven, or no, 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 or nothing at all. These days, as the city thrummed and churned and grew, working white women had plenty of options for jobs that wouldn't kill them. Sales clerks, cashiers, stenographers, secretaries, librarians, and telephone operators who worked the switchboard at the New York Telephone Company's new headquarters, a soaring Art Deco skyscraper, the exact opposite of the dark and sprawling Seaview. As the weeks passed, the exodus to Seaview became impossible to ignore, and soon word reached the new Commissioner of Health, Dr. Shirley Wynn. A dapper gentleman who was dedicated to his job, Wynn had reorganized the city's infectious disease hospitals and was currently focused on a massive public health campaign aimed at eliminating a different disease, diphtheria, a bacterial infection responsible for killing thousands of New York's children each year. Months before, doctors had unveiled a vaccine, but previous mishaps with anti-diphtheric drugs had left parents hesitant to vaccinate their children. Frustrated, Wynn began marketing it in, quote, the same manner as chewing gum, a second family car, or cigarettes. Leaflets announcing its safety were slipped in with phone bills, billboards and illustrated posters went up in Times Square, and health mobiles. Renovated snow removal trucks retrofitted with refrigerators to store the vaccine fanned out into neighborhoods. Inside, a nurse, fluent in each area's predominant language, encouraged parents to vaccinate their children.
But the staffing shortage at Seaview presented Wynne with a different crisis, one health mobiles and vaccines couldn't fix. Tuberculosis had no cure.
Thank you. One of my first questions is both for you, Maria, and Virginia. Virginia, what led you to nursing as a profession? And then for you, Maria, what led you to journalism?
I was led to nursing through my aunt, Edna Sutton Ballard. I admired her, and of course the white starched uniforms. And when I was 16, I graduated from high school, and I asked my parents if I could move to New York to be with my aunt and go to nursing school. I just felt that I wanted to help people.
My mother died of breast cancer when I was young, and 3 months before my mother died, my best friend had died of Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so I went to graduate school to study two things that I loved, English, and then I realized religion, death, and dying. And I enrolled in a PhD program. And while I was there, I started volunteering at Boston Children's Hospital on the bone marrow transplant unit. And I did that for 3 years while finishing the coursework for the PhD, and then I got to the end of it, and they said, well, now you have to write a dissertation. And I said, well, I don't want to write like this. I want to write human stories. And so I got a master's degree. I never wrote the dissertation. I started teaching, and then I started working as a science editor at Springer. And it was while I was editing a book on a rare lung disease where I came across a line that the cure for tuberculosis was found at Seaview Hospital. Started researching that. Up came the articles, and tucked alongside of the articles was a story about Miss Virginia Allen and this group of black nurses called the Black Angels. And so I said, who are these women? And I kind of set out to find them, and I found Virginia. And that's how I came to being a full-time journalist.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So I'm thinking about you all taking care of patients, whether that was adults or children. Virginia, can you tell us what was a day like working at Seaview Hospital, specifically in the pediatric ward?
There were 20 city hospitals. Of those 20 hospitals, only 4 hospitals hired black nurses, which was ridiculous, especially since there was a nursing shortage. And Seaview Hospital especially had a shortage of nurses. I really enjoyed working with the children. I guess, too, because I related to them. I was young. You make rounds, as you always do. And, of course, the children were waiting eagerly to speak to you. So I would go and speak to each child separately because you know them individually. And you treated them as if they were your child. Some of the children were sicker than others. Others wanted a lot of attention, like any other child. And you did the activities of daily living. You assisted them with their homework or physical or occupational therapy. So it was a joy.
I'm also interested, Maria, in knowing more about the sources and the material that you used to write the book, because as a historian, if you love gossip, go into an archive. That's where all the diaries and letters are at, the fights. Like, oh my goodness, like it's in the archives, you'll find it.
Well, the nurse's story had no archives. These women were completely erased from one of the most galvanizing moments in global history, the cure for tuberculosis. And so when I finally tracked down Virginia, she was volunteering at the Schomburg in Manhattan, and she said to me, "Come and meet me for lunch." And we sat in a little cafe in Harlem Hospital, and we talked. But we didn't talk about this story. We talked about everything else. We talked about the Schomburg, the exhibits. We talked about Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and Harlem and history. And I did this for 6 or 7 weeks, every Wednesday. And right before I left, she'd give me a snippet and tell me, "Go find something." And I was like, "Go find what? There's no archives." And so I'd come back the next week and tell her a little bit more. And finally, it was like she was vetting me. She invited me to Staten Island one day. And she will tell you she lives in the restored nurses' residence, which is surrounded by the hollowed-out buildings of Seaview. And she took me on a walking tour, and she pointed at the buildings, and she started telling me the story. And it was there where it began to unfold. And that is how I came to this story. It's surprisingly, the most surprising thing was that it had never been told. And I kept saying to her, "Do you understand what you did?" And she said, "We did our job." And I said, "No, you did more than your job." When Virginia said, "Tell this story and put it together," and I thought to myself, okay, there are no archives. This is going to be an oral history. And so the first thing I did was I knew I had to listen. I started with Virginia, and she introduced me to the families of the nurses. I listened, I decentered myself, and it took years of me just hearing their stories, and the narrative arc of the story of the Black Angels came from them. It is a collection of their voices, and then I, as a historian, began to overlay the bigger global events. The Great Depression, the Great Migration, World War II, and then as I started to get more micro, focused into the history of the profession of nursing, I was like, wait a second, these women did not just come up like this. Like, they endured immense amount of, as Ravenne mentioned and Joanna mentioned, racism within the profession, because the same country that drew lines around water fountains and bus stations drew them around hospitals. And this was no easy task for these women who were promised certain things when they came up to New York City in the early 30s that never materialized. They experienced the same kind of placards on the dining room tables at Seaview, the same kind of inability to transfer. And so that is really the story of the nurses, is oral from them, from these hundreds of hours of interviews.
Maria and I talk frequently, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, and we discuss various subjects, especially about nursing and the backgrounds of the nurses who worked at Seaview. It's a very, very rich history. The training I received from the nurses at Seaview, we had a big education department. And the training I received has served me well. I enjoyed what I was doing. And I have carried that over throughout my life. I'm 92 now. And I have been working all my life. And I'm still working.
Can you talk a little bit more about what nursing looks like for you after you left Seaview?
I worked in the OR in Brooklyn Jewish Hospital and also Staten Island University Hospital. But while I was working at Brooklyn Jewish, the union tried to organize the nurses, and I didn't feel that nurses should be in unions at that time. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it was professional. So at that time, So I fought the union and I won. Leon Davis, who was the president at that time, wanted to find out who I was. So when he met me, we had a talk, and they invited me to work for the union. And that's how I became a union administrator. Which I must say I enjoyed very much, because you are representing the working people. Yes. And making certain that management is living up to their side of the bargain.
Can you talk a little bit more about the work that you are doing in the community? I'm specifically thinking about your work around like voter registration, door knocking, and working with Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, I have been working with the Board of Elections on Staten Island over 43 years. And I just took 2 tests recently so that I will be able to do the early voting. But I also enjoy working in the community because you can see the fruits of your labor. And it's good to get people involved.
Maria, what was it like being entrusted as a white woman to write some of these stories and making sure that you were really doing due diligence to, like writing Virginia's story and the other Black angels?
Well, as I said in the beginning, I knew that this story was an oral history and that what I needed to do was just listen. I just listened, and I am so grateful to Virginia and all of the other families of the nurses who were gracious enough to let me into their lives and talk to me for years and years and years about everything from what color nail polish did Missouri wear, did she have a deep voice or a high-pitched voice? And as I said, I just sat back quietly and I let the narrative evolve from them because I knew that it was their story. Mm-hmm. I was just a collector, a vessel to collect these stories and put them into a cohesive narrative so everyone else can hear the story, because otherwise the story would have just remained in the confines of Staten Island and not in the greater wide world, and it deserved to get out there. I really believed that this story, it's not just a story of nursing, it is a story of resilience. Mm-hmm. It's a story of medicine. They were part of this incredible, galvanizing moment in history. It's just mind-blowing to me that the cure for tuberculosis is talked about only from white men. They have the accolades.
Now that Black Angels is published, what do you hope to see, in the future of healthcare as a result of this book?
Equity, affordable drugs, and accessibility. But regarding this story, and Virginia sitting here, I hope that it is known far and wide. I hope it becomes part of your history, American history, Black history, medical history, women's history. I hope that you all have the opportunity to read it. Despite all of the turmoil and toil that these nurses went through, this is ultimately a story of triumph and hope. And these nurses are always willing to take care of the rest of us when nobody else wants to. Mm-hmm. And Virginia Allen always says to me, if we don't take care of each other, then what do we have, right? And so for me, the story of the Black Angels is a story of these women who saved tens of millions of lives with the advent of isoniazid and being on the front lines, and in doing so changed the course of history. And I hope that they are cemented in history in the same way as hidden figures and other women who have done magnificent things in science, in medicine, and in the world. And so that's my hope for this story and for Virginia, and I hope she lives long enough to see it happen.
Thank you, Maria, for sharing that. And just one last thank you for Miss Virginia for your dedication and putting yourself out there when no one else wanted to. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, questions.
So I'm just like amazed that I didn't even know my own history. That I knew somebody who worked at Seaview, and she told me about Seaview and what they went through. So hearing this, I'm just in shock and in awe. God bless you, all the work you've done. This is amazing.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Khalid Brown. I work in infectious disease, infection control. So to stand in your presence is an honor. Ms. Virginia, I am just so honored and privileged to stand here, especially having worked in my career is infectious disease, infection prevention, and all of the work that I do with patients with tuberculosis or even latent tuberculosis. So thank you for all that you have done and your service to this profession. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I really feel loved.
Hi, I'm Dr. Danielle McCamey. It's such an honor to share this time with you. And so my question is, so me being the founder, CEO, president of DNPs of Color, and seeing this amazing group of individuals and understanding the mission, the purpose, and the charge, I want to ask you, because I want to be responsible in honoring your legacy that you've built and the path that you've blazed for us and the game that you've changed. What charge do you have for me as a leader of this organization and for us? What things would you want us to do? Because I want to be mindful of our responsibility to carry the work further and to also bring people along.
I want to thank this organization from the bottom of my heart. I've enjoyed every moment I've spent with you. My charge would be continue the work that you've started and branch out and make sure every young lady and young man who wants a profession in nursing can be afforded it, because we need you. You're needed. And I'm very proud to see so many of you here. Makes me proud.
That was nurse, trailblazer, and the last known living Black angel, Virginia Allen, author Maria Smilios, and creators of the Nurses You Should Know project, nurses Joanna Seltzer Uribe and Ravenne Aponte. We were delighted by the audience response and thrilled to chat with Virginia and Maria backstage for just a few moments.
And so, Virginia, you have been such a keeper of these important stories. You commented working with labor unions and that you had worked with Martin Luther King. Could you just start from there? How did you meet Martin Luther King?
I met Dr. King when we were striking in South Carolina, and the union sent people down to walk the picket line and support the striking workers in the hospital. And they were mainly women, Black women, who were striking. And he was very, very supportive of us. Every year he would come and speak. And we called it day of solidarity. And I must say, I was very introverted and shy when I went to work for the union, but it gave me a lot of courage, walking the picket lines and demanding our rights. And it formed, I guess you would call a defiant spirit. And that's how I met Dr. King, from the strike we had in South Carolina.
So those early influences and then being in the presence of Dr. King, it seems like it's had a profound effect on the work that you have continued to do.
I'm sure it framed a lot of my thinking over the years, being a delegate for the workers. When I was working for the union, fighting for the rights and maintaining the contracts that we had won, because, you know, it's so easy for management to forget about the contract, go back to the old ways, but you have to keep them on the straight and narrow.
You said up on stage today that you continue to work. There are things that you're doing with your community, volunteering at different museums, knocking on people's doors, making sure that they know about upcoming elections. What are those other things that you continue to do to actually nurse and take care of your community?
Voting. And that's the big thing with me. I think that each and every one of us should bring 10 people to the polls. You know, don't go alone.
Don't go alone.
Always take someone with you when you're going to vote, because the vote is where we have the strength.
Did you ever think about nursing as being an act of social justice?
Yes. When I started working for the union.
How have you helped nurses and nursing to understand how to use their practice as a way to support and bring to fruition policies that do allow all of us to have the conditions where we can have better help?
By being involved in your community, know what's going on in the schools. I've always served on the school board. Every parent should be in the PTA. Know what your children are doing in school and at home.
Yeah.
You have to be involved.
I'm thinking about that image of nurses taking care of people who are hospitalized for months and years, hundreds of days back to back. The book is really talking about the Black Angels. How many nurses do you think that encompasses?
Hundreds. I feel very privileged and honored to be representing over 300 nurses.
And when
many of them I knew personally, I worked with. They were friends of my aunts. We visited. It was like family.
Yeah. You have been so committed to making sure that the stories of the nurses and the people that you took care of, the communities that you were impacting, not be forgotten, that they are captured and they are told. If you were going to see them again, what would you tell them? How would you describe what's going on right now?
At least it wasn't in vain. It's important to be remembered. They would be very pleased, especially knowing that they are appreciated. Their work is remembered and appreciated. And as we said before, the doctors received a lot of recognition, but the nurses were overlooked.
No longer.
I agree.
Well, you have been such a delightful discussion partner to be interviewing with me. I really appreciate that. So, want to get some lunch?
Yes, let's get something to read.
There was a crowd of eager fans waiting outside to meet Virginia, so we let her head off to lunch and took the opportunity to chat with Maria. So Maria, when we were interviewing Virginia, the question I asked her was, what would you like to tell your colleagues, those Black angels that worked alongside with you, if they could be here now and see this room of nurses that looked like them, incredibly accomplished, working at the highest levels of government, health systems, policy. When you were listening to her response, I noticed that you got choked up.
So I've listened to Virginia answer that question a lot, and over the 8 years, every time she says that their work wasn't in vain and that they feel seen, it brings tears to my eyes, because after spending years and years and hundreds of hours listening to the families tell me stories and listening to the patients, these were women who were not seen. And finally, somebody wants to hear the whole story. They want to hear what Maria used to do on her free time, what kind of books she read, what inspired her, not just that she went into a hospital and worked with people who had tuberculosis, which is true, but they were not seen. And there's an iconic photograph that went global, and it's an image of women dancing in the hallway. It's these patients that were dying, and now they're jitterbugging, and behind them are the nurses, and their expressions are stayed, and they knew a different story. And I had posted that picture on my desk. It was on my wall for years, and I looked at it, and I just kept thinking, people walked by you, reporters, journalists, went into that hospital, they descended on them, literally. And nobody asked a question. Nobody asked you. And you knew everything because you were on the front lines. Mm-hmm. And now you're being seen. And it moves me because we all want to be seen. We all want our stories to be told and to be honored, even though we might not go into something with the intent of doing that, which they didn't. Virginia says we just worked.
And it feels like with the book now being out, that I think it's starting to sink in and feel this was important and powerful and revolutionary and transformational.
It was. I think you're right about that. It's gone beyond Staten Island, where it's lived for so long, and people love her and love the story. And now she's seeing that there are other people that want to recognize the importance of this story and this galvanizing moment that these women had a role in. And I think it's really starting to sink in that there was something really powerful that happened in that hospital with her colleagues and her aunt and these women who she called her family.
And it was interesting watching the audience today that as they see themselves also on the front line of many issues of equity, access, marginalization, emerging new viruses, people dying unnecessarily. It seemed to me that their response back was, this is why we need to continue doing the work we do. The courage and the actions and speaking up and taking risk did make transformational change. They had the courage to go to new places, to go into places where they weren't welcome, and to bring their very best, to learn and become as skilled as they possibly can, to have the highest level of practice, and to make sure that people got the very best care. I saw it as we think about our clinical work and our clinical skills, that in all of this, there is a way to care for people, but also move humanity forward, move our science forward, move our practice forward.
You're right about that. They were trailblazers. They were professionals. They wanted to have professional careers. They wanted to own a home. They wanted to be able to sit without somebody telling them you can't sit there. These are not big asks in life. They had to leave their homes to do this. They went with the Great Migration. They left their homes. They left their loved ones behind. Edna leaves
her youngest sister, who she was tasked to raise by her parents. She's 20 years older than her youngest sister. She was 10. She dropped her off at her brother's house. People left daughters, sons, husbands behind and went and worked. And so it is a story about migration and movement as well. It's a story about what is left behind when you decide you want to follow a pathway to change your situation, and in doing so, change the lives of people who you can help, even if there's no cure. At least you're seeing the patients. They bared witness to the patients, and I think in this book, we bear witness to them. And that is important. We need to bear witness to what people have done in history, especially women like this.
Reading through the stories, it reminds us that there's still a lot of work to do. The book, The Black Angels, and the story of all of these nurses, it encapsulates the multiple layers and the multiple stories. Who are the audiences that are going to really find meaning and purpose in reading this?
Everybody. It is written to be picked up and read like a novel. It is a narrative story about the hidden figures of nursing. And so I think anybody who cares about history, American history, Black history, medical history, infectious disease, people who just love a good story, race in America, women in science, would love this book. I would describe it as a book that in many ways is dark. It's about a sanatorium. It's about people who were very, very grievously ill, second-class citizens. They were immigrants that were sent there. They brought up women who were considered second-class citizens to take care of them on this island that you could only get to by ferry boat. In the end, it is a story of triumph and hope. It's a story that shows us that there are always people who are willing to take care of us. And that's what those nurses did. And by doing it, they saved tens of millions of lives, and they changed the course of global history.
A huge thanks to author Maria Smilios and trailblazing nurse and community activist Virginia Allen for their curiosity and persistence and commitment to recovering and sharing the stories and narratives, the risk and contributions of these remarkable trailblazing Black female nurses, the patients they cared for, communities they built, and the monumental breakthroughs in science and civil rights they were at the forefront of. And special thanks to nursing game changer Danielle McCamey and the DNPs of Color organization for inviting See You Now to be a part of their high energy conference. As you can hear from the applause, laughter, and feel the appreciation and love, a lot of fun and fellowship was had at the DNPs of Color conference. And See You Now was delighted to be part of it and mark our 100th episode milestone in such a fitting and festive fashion. The gathering and celebration was full of surprises and highlights, including the announcement of the Virginia Allen and the Black Angels Scholarship Fund, aimed at supporting nurses who aspire to further their education and uplift the next generation of dedicated nurses. Established by the DNPs of Color, this scholarship honors Virginia and the extraordinary contributions of the Black Angels. To dig deeper into the impact of the Black Angels, a National Nursing Book Club is being organized for February 2024. It'll delve into all the chapters of the Black Angels book, be jam-packed with guest speakers, including author Maria Smilios, and free online resources curated from 8 years of Maria's research for the book. To learn more, check out our show notes at seeyounowpodcast.com, where you'll find a treasure trove of resources and links to the images from the DNPs of Color conference. And to help us celebrate 100 episodes, the best way to show your love and support is to share this podcast with your friends and take a moment to rate and review us on your podcasting app. The more people who listen, the healthier and merrier we'll all be. For See You Now, I'm Shauna Butler. Thanks for listening, and thank you for 100 episodes. Here's to hundreds more.
Nurses are transforming healthcare through innovation, compassion, and leadership. And Johnson & Johnson is proud to continue its 125-year commitment to champion nurses through recognition, skill building, leadership development, and more. The American Nurses Association is dedicated to building a culture of innovation. Nurses improve the lives of patients and communities through innovative thinking, empathetic connection, scientific rigor, and sheer determination. ANA is proud to support and advocate for our nation's most valuable healthcare resource, our nurses. For more information on See You Now and to listen to any of the earlier episodes in our library, visit seeyounowpodcast.com.